Tilda, let's talk about why men's rights activists have feelings. It sounds ridiculous, and it probably is, and yet this is the title of this academic feminist paper. Now, I read this paper through numerous times, and with some degree of confusion, because there is a lot written down in this paper, but really not very much that is actually said. So I kept reading it, and rereading it, and rereading it, and rereading it some more, and I was thinking there's got to be something that I'm missing here, some angle that I can think about this from, some little trick that I can use that will just unlock the entire thing and suddenly it'll start making sense, and it never did. It was never expansive in any capacity beyond its core message, and I can tell you what its core message is right now. Feels equals reals, except when men do it, and men's rights activists are scared of getting fucked in the arse. And that's why they're a bunch of crying man-babies. I wish I could say I was exaggerating, but that really is the cut and thrust of this paper. And it achieves this outcome, or this hypothesis, or this theory, as I'm sure they're going to try and term it, by listening to what feminists have said about the men's rights movement, what one person on an internet forum said somewhere that one time, and then just a load of mental gymnastics. So I'm going to be going through bits of this paper. I'm not going to be covering all of it, because, as I said, it writes an awful lot, but there's not actually a whole lot that is said within. But I'll pick out all of the key points that this author tries to make, and it'll all fall into place, hopefully, just how ridiculous this is. So the abstract reads, the men's rights movement and its academic offshoot, new male studies, are considered in light of the turn to affect. I argue that affective utterances, I feel, become phallic in the men's rights movement and function in a defensive mode. Unlike the phallus as guarantor of masculinity, which is currently up for debate, the affective utterance cannot be denied. That is, affect is wholly subjective. However, we can, as theorists, ask questions about how and why affect is being used. So the paper starts by telling us that it's going to be going through a lot of affect theory. And affect theory is basically just the observation of how people express emotions. So you're happy, you smile, you're sad, you cry. Studying things like that would fall under the general umbrella of affect theory. So this paper claims that it's going to look at why men's rights activists behave the way they do by examining the supposed emotions behind the actions. And the part about affective utterance cannot be denied, that's quite a big part of this paper, because as we've repeatedly heard from feminists, feels equals reals. If you feel like you are a victim of something, then you must have been a victim of it. So in that framework, men's rights activists feeling like there's some sort of injustice being done to men somewhere, somehow, can't be denied under the feminist feels equals reals rubric. And this paper will then go on to basically try and tell you that feels do not really equal reals, but only sometimes. Like when the men's rights movement does it, by very odd coincidence. And one final thing which I'd like to bring up in the abstract, just before we go any further, is this concept of phallus as guarantor of masculinity. Basically, if you have a penis, you will immediately be seen as a proper man. Now, I find this a very odd position for a feminist academic to take, especially in light of the whole feminist Twitter hashtag masculinity so fragile stuff, which is partially correct, but is horrendously misused by feminists, because they turn hashtag masculinity so fragile into an excuse to just bash and hate on men whenever they do things or express sentiments or emotions which are inconvenient to that feminist woman at that moment in time. But the reality is that the state of masculinity is quite fragile and is not guaranteed by your simply having a penis. The reality is that the concept of masculinity, of being a real man, is actually predicated on your actions, and it is actually specifically the actions that benefit others, but usually actions that benefit women. All you have to do is look around at general attitudes towards it and you'll see it. A real man takes care of other people. A real man is a provider. A real man knows how to fix things. because all of those things benefit other people, usually the woman in his life. And yet you'll never see the "you're a real man" thing being applied to men who are a bit more of the MGTOW bent. Men who are happy in their own company and simply look after themselves and their own interests. In fact, those men will normally be shamed for their life decision. If you want to know more about this, someone that I highly recommend you listen to is someone on YouTube by the name of Tom Golden. He runs a channel called Men Are Good. He's worked for 30 plus years as a therapist, written 3 books about men and their healing and emotional processes, and was also in the movie The Red Pill. So well worth checking out. So with all of that out of the way, let's move on with this paper, shall we? So the paper begins with a little bit of waffle about the first Canadian university to have a men's collective centre, which was supposed to deal with men's issues and how it was shut down, and how Toronto University tried to have some lectures given by some guest speakers who represented the men's rights movement, and how they were also shut down. And then they've got to get the cheap little potshot quip in that the word misandry is not recognised by Microsoft Word, because apparently that's an argument now. Too bad for this feminist scholar and the keywords for this paper. Microsoft Word also doesn't recognise the term anality, so I guess that invalidates your entire field of study then, doesn't it? Just as long as we're trying to be consistent and all that. The author then goes on to say, "I admit that I am utterly fascinated by the men's rights movement for a number of reasons, ranging from their seemingly sudden presence to the kinds of arguments that are made, the so-called villain of their ideological framework, and perhaps most especially because of how violent and aggressive its politics are, while simultaneously denying repeatedly that it is misogynistic, homophobic, transphobic, phallocentric, and patriarchal." Now, I find this very interesting for a number of reasons. I've made no particular secret of the fact that I'm relatively indifferent to the existence of the men's rights movement as a whole, although by looking at certain social issues and empirical data surrounding it, I do find that in some cases a lot of my views actually align with theirs. And also for people who follow me everywhere on the internet, you probably know by now that I do occasionally guest over on Honey Badger Radio, which is a men's rights program. And the thing that a lot of people will know about that particular organization, since it is the largest men's rights platform on YouTube, it is basically run entirely by women. But of course, we all know the inevitable answer to that, and it goes something along the lines of internalized misogyny, or some other nonsense like that. But on the charge of homophobia, I decided to do a little bit of digging around some men's rights websites to see what I could find on the issue. Surely if the movement is openly homophobic, it should be very easy to find some gay-bashing rhetoric somewhere. And then I stumbled upon this article. Gays Against Feminism, Because Gay People Are Not Your Property Feminists, written by Dean Esme. Let's see what he has to say on the subject. "A gay friend online recently gave me this card," and it's a little picture of a gay card. "Since I've stood up for gay rights since back in the early 1980s, I'll take it and use it. I'm a moral fag by nature anyway. Look it up. Back when there was an actual social and political cost to being gay-friendly, let alone being gay, I almost certainly would have been beaten up badly had I shown someone that card. That was back when it was socially acceptable to beat the fuck out of a gay man just for being gay, or suspected gay. It was when being friendly to faggots and dykes and trannies all by itself could also get you hurt or fired from your job. I do not want to make it out like I took a bullet for anybody. I did not. Although I did once rescue a drunk gay man whose abusive boyfriend had gotten him liquored up and left him stranded miles from home with no money in a tough working-class blue-collar bar. He was sweet and affectionate and kept hitting on guys, so I literally took him under my arm, cuddled him a bit, told him to stop trying to kiss me and said, 'Come on man, let's get you out of here,' and took him home and put him on my couch where he promptly passed out. The next day we went to his boyfriend's house and, while the boyfriend was away, I helped him clear his shit out and find his car keys so he could go stay with friends he trusted." Well, that's just the start of the article. It does go on for a little bit, and unsurprisingly the rest of it follows very much in that tone. No homophobia, no gay bashing, nothing along those lines. But a fair old amount of sticking up for gay rights. But you know, that's just one author, just one man, even though he is quite a prominent voice within the movement, so let's see what someone else has to say. The Problem with Gay Rights by Paul Elam. Ooh, surely this one is a smoking gun, right? Well, let's see what he has to say about gay men. Gay men have invented new technology, built cities, researched cures for disease, made profound contributions to the arts, literature, and philosophy, excelled in athletics, and participated wholly in every aspect of the development of civilization as we know it. But of course, they did not do these things because they were gay. They did these things because they were men. Solving problems and making advances is what men do, and there is no evidence to suggest that gay men are any less proficient at this than straight men are. And herein, in my opinion, lies the problem. We live in a culture that doesn't regard gay men as men, so it would stand to reason that a movement of social awareness and enlightenment, proffering that men who are gay are no less men than men who are straight, would have been in order, and it would have served a purpose not dissimilar from what we see in the men's rights movement today, to wit, that holding men to standards and expectations based on sex while relieving women of their corresponding expectations has led directly to their systematic, conscripted misuse as human beings. By embracing feminist ideology and misandry, gay men only buy into the myth that they are not, and shouldn't be, men, and by allowing themselves to be co-opted by a group of ideologues that hate men to the core, they have only further undermined solutions to their very real problems. And this leaves us with what we see in the gay rights movement today, a dissonant ideology that is designed to attack the very nature of who they are. For in the end, whether you are an avowed deconstructionalist of traditional masculinity, or an equally fervent traditionalist that thinks real men sit tall in the saddle and lay their coats in the mud for women to walk on, gay men will remain what they are, men. And to whatever extent they seek to include themselves in the rights of men in the modern zeitgeist, they will invariably suffer the consequences of that pursuit. Further on, he talks about other gay rights issues, such as gay marriage, and then the problem, as the title suggests that he lays out, is that allowing gay people to marry then also allows them to divorce and go through those wonderful proceedings of having all of their stuff messed up. Because divorces, no matter how clean you think they are always very messy things indeed. That's the price you pay for getting the state involved in your love life. Which is why this is then said. Gay men are and always have been resented because they provide no utility to women. They are literally born free of the constraining and egregiously burdensome expectations that heterosexual men are still raised to fulfill. They are, in fact, the natural recipients of what many men in the men's movement clamour for every day, freedom from the control of women and from the control of the state on women's behalf. It is my hope that this movement comes to invite and include gay men within the ranks, not as gays, but as men, and I fear that this will take some real time. Time for the very few within our ranks that actually hate gays for being gay to either wise up or leave, and time for many gays to wake up and understand that ideologies like feminism based on hating men will only produce self-hatred and worse. Right now, the agenda for feminists includes sending men to the altar and ultimately family courts and to combat zones. Men should work together to avoid both. So that was just a few little excerpts from that article there, from Paul Elam, the founder of A Voice for Men. So that's the founder of what I believe is the biggest men's rights website on the internet, stating that homophobia is not welcome within the movement. So yeah, I'm not really seeing the supposed homophobia here. And on the issue of transphobia, well, there's an article written by a trans man on A Voice for Men, who documents their transition from female to male in the post called From Woman to Man to Red Pill, in which the author talks about how they went from being a woman, being praised and recognised as generally worth existing in society all the time, to becoming a man. And a brief excerpt of the author's description of that is, "Society either uses me or ignores me, because I'm not attractive enough to be a piece of meat. I'm instead just an ugly, hairy beast with a wallet and a pair of muscular arms. Or, might I say with some measure of irony, a piece of meat that doesn't even rate a catcall." So that's a trans author stepping into this supposed hotbed of transphobia. Can we call all of these accusations completely hollow and baseless yet? We can? Good. Moving on. The paper continues, "In the context of this article, I am chiefly interested in the young men who participate in these groups, the kind of discursive arguments put forward on campuses, and how we as scholars of gender can respond. I am not thus thinking about the particularities, for instance, of fathers' rights groups, which, while often aligned with the larger men's rights movement, are focused squarely on the issues of the father and the child. Likewise, another faction of the men's rights movement might include intactivist, which is broadly considered to be an anti-circumcision movement that began in the early 1980s around the time of Edward Wallerstein's Circumcision, an American Health Fallacy. In this movement, circumcision, especially routine neonatal circumcision, is framed as a violation of genital integrity, and thus the infant male's rights to that integrity. There are, of course, valuable discussions to be had about the common ground between various groups in the larger men's rights movement. However, this would require a much larger space that would be able to draw on a much larger body of knowledge." So I find it very interesting in this paper that this author is just outright stating, I'm not going to address the fathers' rights movement, and I'm not going to address the protesting of circumcision in children. Presumably because, unfortunately for that author, these are both areas of the men's rights movement which have a lot of objective data backing them up. So moving on a little bit, the author tells us how they're going to be working at the intersection of affect theory and critical studies, otherwise known as Marxism. The author goes on to note, in this case correctly, that there is a journal of new male studies, which acts as an academic forum in which men's rights activists are welcome to publish their findings, and also notes that the website A Voice for Men has endorsed glowingly the works of writers like Warren Farrell, Paul Nathanson, Catherine K. Young, Janice Fiamengo, Miles Groth, and others, and that this is in essence creating a canon of works that ought to be read by men's rights activists. Something that seems very curious to me about this author is that they've clearly read a little bit, at least, of A Voice for Men, and yet they seem to have somehow completely missed the anti-homophobia on that website, among other things, to come to the bizarre conclusion that they did earlier about the homophobia, transphobia, herby-derpy-derp bunch of bigots. To me, that suggests that this author might be a little bit poor at doing a bit of light reading. So I'm now going to take a moment, if I may, to get down with all the hip kids and do what the popular song says and jump around, so that you can see the image of the men's rights movement that this author attempts to construct. And he does this by drawing quite heavily on the opinions of Michael Kimmel, the person who created that film, The Mask You Live In, which should tell you pretty much all you need to know about Kimmel's opinion of men and masculinity. And that is, of course, that masculinity is toxic. So let's see what this author considers the men's rights movement to be. Men's rights intellectuals, in their attempts to save maleness and masculinity, insist upon and deploy the language of affect, even though, more often than not, they are only capable of demonstrating that they are angry and fearful, and it would seem that other affects are simply not an option. Do men experience joy? Certainly not. If one reads through men's rights writings, what one finds over and over again is anger. Michael Kimmel's recent book is aptly titled Angry White Men, American Men and the End of an Era. But what is certain is that we are surrounded by a great deal of angry men lamenting their loss of rights, how feminism has attacked their right to maleness, and so on. I'm a critical theorist of gender, so my intention here is not to outline the theoretical and methodological problems of the movement, but rather to work through what is happening, how we might theorize the men's rights movement, what is motivating this movement, and how we need to shift the dialogue to consider ideas of shame and humiliation, which I will demonstrate is intimately caught up in castration anxiety. So we've pretty much established the author's point here. Men's rights activists are just angry and afraid of losing their power, and are ultimately scared of being shamed or humiliated via the loss of their manhood. And I'm going to read a little paragraph now, and this is 3 pages in from the beginning. Now, you may notice a few paragraphs ago this author said that they are going to be working at the intersection of affect theory and critical studies, and further to this they then list that their work reads critically the rise of the movement and what it means for the critical studies of men and masculinities, since the discipline is committed to a pro-feminist, anti-homophobic, anti-racist pedagogy and practice. So this is the next page over, and the author basically repeats themselves. And hopefully this will start to show you why I found this paper really actually quite horrendous to read, because it writes a lot but says nothing. So the author verbosely repeats himself. This article holds to a pro-feminist angle of inquiry and embraces ideas of masculinity studies which are informed by feminist theory and which work to unpack ideas and ideologies surrounding masculinities. To study masculinity requires that the field must be informed and committed to a pro-feminist, or simply put, feminist agenda, including anti-racist and homophobic pedagogies. Declaring masculinity studies as such is important, especially today, living in rape culture, a culture that is witnessing the rise of misogynistic, transphobic, homophobic men's rights activists on university and college campuses, a culture of slut-shaming, continued violence against women, trans men and trans women, and gender-queer kids. Too many suicides of victims of bullying, and the faceless acts of violence committed on the internet each and every day whenever a woman dares to speak, whenever a feminist dares to demand an answer, and whenever a queer kid asks for justice. To study masculinity today requires we be cognizant of what is happening in these various spaces, and to once more reaffirm our commitment to feminist pedagogies, theories, and activisms. As such, what is politically at stake in this article is an argument about why scholars of masculinity studies, those of us who would be dismissed as pro-feminist scholars by the men's rights movement, need to pay attention to this movement and need to think carefully about what is happening on our campuses. Well, talk about wearing your allegiances on your sleeve. Any discussion about masculinity must be done in a pro-feminist framework because reasons. And this use of the feminist framework is actually then what begins causing this author so many problems. As I stated earlier, this author then finds the use of affect by the men's rights movement, that is specifically the expression of anger, to be very, very interesting, because as this author will go on to state, and we'll look at it when we get there, when someone says that they're feeling something, you can't deny it, because lived experience and feels equals reals. And it's very interesting watching this author try to square that circle, because they want to disagree with the men's rights movement, but the framework that they're operating in doesn't allow them to. So let's read a little bit more. What is so striking is how affective the men's rights movement has become, how it has co-opted the language of affect, emotion, feeling, and the personal being political to meet its own ends. The men's rights movement, we might say, has appropriated the language of feminist consciousness raising. The men's rights movement may well be a post-feminist strange stirring. I want to be very careful here, for I am not interested in advancing the men's rights movement's politics, but rather I am interested in exploring how affect informs these movements and what our responses to these affects might be. That is, I want to take seriously their claim of feeling, and why someone like Dr. Warren Farrell would want men to speak about their feelings. Simon O'Sullivan notes, "There is no denying or deferring affects, and that affects are the stuff that goes beneath, beyond, and even parallel to signification, and further that you cannot read affects, you can only experience them. If we admit that this is the case, then the declaring of affect is a remarkably powerful declaration, precisely because it cannot be denied. That is, by turning to affect, the men's rights activists do not need to prove the truth of their claims, because their affects, the feeling that it is true, trump the veracity of the thing causing the feeling. I do not believe it is an accident that white men are turning to affective utterances to mark their claims. Indeed, there is something remarkably political about these claims. These claims become indisputable precisely because affects cannot be read. One can only experience them. And in this regard, the men's rights activists become essentially phenomenological. My experiences are my experiences, and you cannot deny them because I believe them to be true. That is, even if quantitative, qualitative, and factual research demonstrates that the apparent cause of these effects is incorrect, wrong, misguided, we can still not deny the veracity of the effect. Indeed, I am going to accept the premise that we cannot deny effect, though I am willing to imagine that some would certainly be willing to mount this argument, and I'd imagine some would be successful, say, faking it crocodile tears and so on. But then, how do we think about affect in this very particular and very gendered scenario of the men's rights movement? For one, I think the answer is to position affect, feeling, and emotion alongside phallicism. That is, I will argue here that affects become phallic, insofar as it will carry on the symbolic role of the phallus, which stands in and up for men. More particularly, I will demonstrate that the turn to affect is provoked by a castration anxiety that has become central to men's rights, and the turn to affect thus reflects the phallus to male subjectivity. That is, castration is a loss that needs to be recuperated, and affective language and utterances will fill this void. Affect, thus, is a way to recuperate the castrated patriarchy in a way that cannot be denied. The turn to affect, thus, is practical, political, and phallic. So, we can't deny the men's rights activists' feels, because feels equals reals, but what the author is going to try to do is to invalidate the feels, even though they've just stated that that's not what they're going to try to do. It is in fact exactly what they try to do. And they do that by basically trying to turn to feeling, this expression of emotion that the men's rights movement supposedly is doing, the author turns it into a giant because penis statement. Since patriarchal and hegemonic masculinity's goal is to become larger, to take up more space and yield less of it, we can turn our attention to the correlation between transformation of the limp penis into the large, hard phallus. And I will argue the question of affect and masculine privilege. Affect in the men's rights movement is phallic insofar as it aims to make issues larger, hoping that their claims will somehow take up more space in our political, legal, cultural, and academic discourse, and ultimately will yield less room to competing discourses, precisely because one's claims to affect or feeling a given way cannot be denied. Just as the phallus cannot, however much we try, be denied, it can be denied access, but its power and symbolism remain essential to a variety of discourses, either as a site of resistance or as a site of power and celebration. Such is the case of the men's rights movement. So here we go. Men's rights activists only express emotions because emotions can't be ignored, and this is their way of man-spreading into the academic and political discourse. You remember how there was that hoax paper a few weeks ago that talked about men trying to rape the space around them? Well, this is a serious feminist academic paper, and it is putting out the exact same notion, but it's doing it seriously. So our author has supposedly established that men's rights activists are turning to feels equals reals because it's their way of continuing being patriarchal oppressive shitlords, and the only reason that they're doing this is because they're afraid of losing their power, basically metaphorically losing their dicks. Now let's get on to my favourite part about this particular academic discourse. The part where the author finally jumps the shark and says men's rights activists are just scared of being fucked in the arse. The author then goes on to talk about a gentleman named Patrick, who was one of Michael Kimmel's angry white men. Patrick further explains, they're everywhere. You know that ad, it's everywhere you want to be. That's like women. They're everywhere they want to be. There's nowhere you can go anymore. Factories, beer joints, military, even the goddamn firehouse. We working guys are just fucked. While we do not see the language of effective utterance, we certainly recognize the way anger is working here, and moreover, how the phallus, how a feminine phallus, since men have lost all power, so the argument of men's rights activists would go, rears its head. Working guys are just fucked. Now, to quickly address the feminine phallus part of that line, there is a point in this paper where this author asserts that all of this affect coming from men's rights organizations, all of these feels and whatnot, are only coming out because feminism has won, so basically women now hold the phallus of society. But we're going to move on from that and all of the hilarious jokes that it will inevitably spawn. The feeling of being just fucked. A not entirely uncommon sentiment among men, and especially in the men's rights movement, is enmeshed in castration and phallicism, and there is a great deal of work to be done surrounding the phallic nature of effective declarations. If it is not women in general who are fucking men, it is their failed mothers, who turned them into soft men, lacking in masculinity and virility, and turned them against their fathers. And if it is not women in general, and mothers in particular, then it is the education system that has privileged girls and feminized education, and so on. I am not interested in attending to the veracity of these claims, because it is less about the realness of these claims and more about feeling that motivates these claims. Guys are just fucked becomes the mantra of a movement that declares that there is a war against boys or that masculinity is in crisis. The movement as a political agenda demanding that we pay attention to its claims, its concerns, its anxieties, seeks to return masculinity and virility to men to their rightful position on top. The issue, however, is not about being fucked, but rather about the shameful and humiliating position in which being fucked has put men. For a man to be fucked, he must submit, place himself beneath, and become the bottom in the hierarchical structure of a language of fucking. As a range of scholars have noted, for a man to be penetrated, which is to say, fucked, is to surrender his masculinity, to abdicate power. When Michael Kimmel's subject Patrick suggests guys are just fucked, his language is fully intentional, especially since fucking is not merely expressive, it is an argument. When Patrick uses the word, he is making a very real argument, especially since the word itself is not neutral or without value. To be fucked and to fuck are not the same as to make love, to have sex, to engage in coitus. We must admit that fucking contains the politically fraught complications of sexual violence. A violence that is equally found in the language which speaks of the war on boys. Whatever is happening is not happening. Men feel that they are getting fucked. They have been fucked, and this is, of course, a fundamentally problematic use of language in a culture that seemingly cannot escape the sway of rape culture and slut-shaming. What is at stake for these men who feel fucked is, of course, their masculinity, which is conferred to them by the phallus that guarantees and confirms masculinity, and almost, and perhaps most importantly, their exclusion and alienation from an increasingly feminized society and their right to claim a victimized identity. But perhaps I have arrived too quickly at a conclusion, and thus I want to work through this language of violence and victimhood, which is intimately connected and embodied in phallic affect. At bottom, the effective utterances are less about being angry and more about being castrated. So there you go, that was the money shot, that was the payoff of this paper. Men's rights activists are uttering their feelings about things because they're scared of losing their male privilege and don't want to get fucked in the arse. Because getting fucked in the arse means you apparently have absolutely no power or ability to do anything. Also, apparently, getting fucked in the arse is shameful for some reason. Probably something to do with toxic masculinity and all of that. Or some of the constant power play that feminists love shoving into sex, whereby the penetrator or penetratee dynamic necessarily translates into person with power and person with no power, which I fundamentally disagree with for numerous reasons that I have repeatedly talked about. And as a side note here, I know I try to keep swearing to a minimum in these videos these days, but I do very much enjoy the fact that I can use the phrase fucked in the arse And in this context, it's an academic term, because apparently the term fucking and to be fucked are political and academic. I love being an anal theorist sometimes. We get the best and most complex of terms. So we're going to continue onwards, and we rejoin our author, who at this point has made their position pretty clear. Men's rights activists are whining and complaining because they've lost their power. Their power is intricately somehow connected to the fact that they have a penis, and because they've lost their metaphorical penis, and women have apparently gained the metaphorical penis, these men are now scared of being fucked in the arse. And thus, them turning to affect, or expressing their emotions, which feminists cannot deny because more lived experience and feels equals reals, this is the men's rights activists' way of growing a new penis. A bigger penis, a better penis, a penis that shall stretch to the stars and fuck the heavens for all eternity. Metaphorically, of course. Boys' aggression, for Corbett, often conceals their anxiety about losing, and thus boys will find a way to compensate for any potential loss. The ultimate goal, of course, is to find a way to express something that cannot and will not ever be lost, the ultimate signifier, which is, above all, the phallic. When guys speak of getting fucked, they are not, of course, castrated, but their claims to masculinity seem to be in doubt, or the right to masculinity might well be lost. The penis has previously guaranteed men's ability to, right to, and entitlement to fuck. But the roles have reversed, and they are now being fucked because, quote, those bitches have taken over, end quote. The author then goes on for about 5 pages, I shit you not, it is actually 5 pages, really trying to hammer home this penis equals power, no penis equals no power, even if only metaphorically, and men are scared of getting fucked in the arse. And I'm just going to read out some of the more choice quotes from those 5 pages, because it will really demonstrate to you how ridiculous this is. Castration becomes thus an important model for thinking about men's feelings, precisely because the feelings are governed by a sense of loss, and moreover, this sense of loss is fundamentally out of control. The greater fear, however, I will contend, is in the phrasing of being fucked and what this reveals about power and dominance. The fear is as much about losing the phallus as it is about submitting to a power that should not have phallic power, the female body and the feminist agenda, which has usurped patriarchal normativity. Michael Foucault and David Hapolin have all noted that to be fucked is to submit, to surrender, and to abdicate power. In other words, to be fucked is to be sexually feminized because the passive role is in some way demeaning. If being fucked feminizes the subject and causes him to surrender power, then surely we must attend to what is being fucked and how that affects one's claim to power and gender. The phallus is the symbol par excellence of masculinity, precisely because its goal is to become larger and take up more space and yield less of it, as I've already noted. But we need to think carefully about what the transformation of the limp penis into the large hard phallus means, precisely because the expanding phallus is protected by the other side of desire, the closed anus. And, more particularly, the tight anus protects masculine space by repelling invasion. The anus becomes important precisely because it is impenetrable, whereas the male body and the phallus attached to it is conquering and inviolable. My contention here is that what is happening in the men's rights movement is that the feelings that are being expressed are located in the fact the body has suddenly become penetrable, and it is seemingly being conquered, or at least the men feel that their body, their right to the phallus, and patriarchy are being conquered by a particularly powerful branch of feminism. To be taken on his knees is to be denied claims to masculinity, and most notably to be denied the power of the phallus. When power is taken from men, the spectre of castration cannot loom far behind. This castration is not necessarily about the physical act, though undoubtedly that is part of the fear, but rather about the displacement of the phallus's power. So much of culture is dependent upon the phallus as a guarantor of life, as a symbol of power, and as central to how we differentiate humans. So, if the fear of the future loss of the phallus, or a persistent circumcising that reminds the male again and again of his first phallic loss, the foreskin, potential loss, the wound of other males, and how that loss still allows for the phallus to function, there must be recourse to another phallic possibility. While one solution would be to speak about how an enthusiastic bottom opens his anus, welcomes other forces, the solution for men's rights activists is to find another phallus that is equally present, visible, assertive, and capable of transformation from meek and mild to wild and excessive. The solution, I contend, is found in men's effective utterances, the ways in which feelings have become essential to the discourse of men's rights activists. Moreover, these feelings cannot be denied. However much I might try, I cannot deny the legitimacy of someone else's feelings. So there we go. I do believe we have finally fulfilled everything that I said at the start of this video. Men's rights activists feel angry because they're losing their privilege in a feminized society. Being more feminized means that these men aren't real men, and their vocal complaints about the fact that they're losing all of their privileges is their way of avoiding becoming feminized, and all of this because being feminized means that you get fucked, and men are scared of getting fucked in the arse. And rather than just learning to like getting fucked in the arse, men's rights activists get angry instead, because that's their way of constructing their new penis and privilege that can never die, because it's been built in the framework laid out by feminists in a feminized society. That's basically what this paper is saying. Thanks, Freud. This is your intellectual legacy, a bunch of pseudo-intellectual, pseudo-philosophical twaddle, which all comes down to someone wanting to fuck something. But our author doesn't stop there. For all his proclamation that he can't deny the feelings of other people, he sure is going to try. The problem with these feelings is they are expressed in the form of anger and violence, and what they are about, I believe, is loss. A loss of control. A threat not caused by feminism, but by the apparent loss of entitled masculinity, a masculinity that affords power for no apparent reason other than biology as destiny. The men's rights movement is largely interested in preserving those arenas of all-male havens, and that sense of entitlement and entitlement thwarted is what lies beneath the surface of much of men's resistance to women's equality. But by attending to questions of affect, we shift the perspective away from mere ideas of loss towards feelings of loss. Feelings are important precisely because they cannot be denied, and they are inherently enmeshed in ideas of entitlement. Men feel as if they have been robbed of something to which they are naturally entitled. At least so the argument goes for men's rights activists. Indeed, if we are to provide critiques of the men's rights movement and its activities, we may well have to focus explicitly on how they are expressing their ideas than on what they are expressing. The ideas and claims of the men's rights movement are already widely dismissed, and it is for this very reason. I argue that men's rights activists have turned explicitly to questions of emotion, feeling, and affect. Men's rights activists are in a state of crisis of their own making. They feel disenfranchised, and as such, seek out an oppressor who will always be feminists and feminism. And since feminism has been successful, these men have co-opted and appropriated some of feminism's most potent arguments, for instance, against victim blaming and the use of affect. Thus, by positioning themselves as feeling like victims, we are confronted by a scenario where, they believe, we have to renounce some of feminism's most important lessons. If men are victims and if men feel bad, we cannot deny the state of victimhood nor the negative affect, so they believe. It is for this reason that men's rights activists have feelings. So, men's rights activists have feelings on things, not because men actually have disadvantages in society, apparently, not because of the objective differences in things like outcomes of divorce proceedings, child custody, both of which favour women, objections to being instantly treated as if you're a perpetrator of violence under the Duluth model, nothing to do with the rights to genital integrity, nothing to do with the gender sentencing gap, which finds women massively less likely to even go to court, and if they do go to court, to always get lesser sentences than men, even when they commit the exact same crime. The common tropes in media of men as bumbling, incompetent buffoons with their perfect wives who just have everything and keep everything together somehow, despite the male's incompetence. All of these talking points, none of them matter. None of them are real. The only reason that men's rights activists express feelings on any of these issues is because feminism has won and they can't handle it. So they're trying to steal feminism's weapons and use them right back at it. Because all of that makes perfect sense. It makes so much more sense than all of the objective things that I have outlined previously, which you can find on any men's rights website, on any of the men's rights podcasts in places like Honey Badger Radio. And oh boy, the ride doesn't stop there, because despite the author claiming that they are not going to try and deny the feels of men's rights activists because my lived experience and feels equals reals, guess what the author then goes ahead and does. I believe it is fair to see that the turn to feeling is about reasserting phallic dominance, a dominance that has never been all that devalued, or even, more particularly, about making the phallus even bigger than it already was. Phallicism is now coupled with affect, and neither can be denied. But there is, of course, something else happening here. Men's rights activists use affect not to express genuine anxieties or fears, outside of homophobia, which I believe is fully genuine, but rather to manufacture a crisis and a state in victimhood in which men are victims of women's violence and feminist tyranny. To turn to affect is about the manufacturing of a state of victimhood that can only be confirmed by hurt feelings, because there is no sound scholarship available to demonstrate that indeed men have a legitimate claim to victimhood. Some men absolutely do, but the claim that all men are victims is fallacious. None of this is proven in fact, and it is a seemingly impossible task because the activists and scholars alike simply do not seem interested in advancing a scholarly sound project, despite vast amounts of funding that would provide longitudinal, qualitative and quantitative studies of men and their claims to victimhood. Instead, the solution is one in which affect is deployed as proof enough. First off, I have spoken to numerous men's rights activists. Not once have I ever heard all men. They are very particular in their areas of interest. You know, things like fathers' rights and intactivism, things which you, Mr. Author, totally ignored. And secondly, I would love to know where that vast amount of funding is. What government grant do men's rights organizations benefit from exactly? Maybe go and look at some of those government-funded male domestic violence shelters. Oh, wait! There is no vast amount of funding behind the men's rights movement. You want to see a paper trail of a vast amount of funding? Look at feminism. Look at women's rights organizations, both international and national. And oh boy, this author is not even done yet, because you've got to deny those feels, because feels don't equal reals when men do it. As much as we have been uncomfortable with denying affect, perhaps it is now time to think seriously about how affect can be misused and abused for political and ideological ends that seemingly have very few intellectual claims that can be certifiably proven. This idiot who wrote this, and I feel completely okay with calling them an idiot, has clearly never spoken to a single men's rights activist ever in their life. He clearly has no awareness of cases such as that of Earl Silverman. You know, the guy who tried to run a men's shelter in Canada, couldn't get any government funding because it had to go through the women's department. He ended up paying for it out of his own pocket, and as a result of the stress, ended up taking his own life. But boy, if only he knew about the vast amount of funding that the men's rights movement gets. And on this last little bit here, we need to start being comfortable about denying people's feelings because they might not be grounded in reality. Try applying a little bit of that logic to feminism. I'm oppressed because the air conditioning is up too high. I'm oppressed because men's knees are more than a certain distance apart on public transport. I'm oppressed because people won't just take my word on everything. They want evidence and things like that. Listen and believe. What you have done here, my dear moronic author, is you have allowed feminism to write the book of rules. And then when other people start playing by the book of rules as dictated by feminists, you have now torn up the rulebook and said, those rules don't count. They're not the real rules. They're not valid. You are the personification of the phrase, one rule for me, another for thee.